episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another truly fascinating guest who is helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us. As a little background, the Minimal Intelligence Laboratory at the Universidad de Murcia in Spain is the world's first laboratory in the world dedicated to the philosophy of plant signaling and behavior, also known as plant neurobiology, and is a multidisciplinary research group with members from all over the world interested in questions about plant intelligence. Their research spans the scientific enterprise, discussing fundamental questions that reside at the intersection of physical, biological, and cognitive systems. Their lab members and collaborators come from a wide variety of backgrounds and perspectives and bring with them quite an eclectic array of methods and ideas. We're honored today to be joined by Dr. Paco Calvo, who is the laboratory director at the Minimum Intelligence Laboratory. He specialized in the philosophy of cognitive science and studies at University of California, San Diego, received his PhD in philosophy at University of Glasgow, and his main interest of research the philosophy of cognitive science with special emphasis on the philosophy of plant neurobiology, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science. Dr. Calvo is co-editor of the Handbook of Cognitive Science and Embodied Approach, the Rutledge Companion to the Philosophy of Psychology, the Architecture of Cognition. His articles have been published all over the place in Adaptive Behavior, the British Journal for Philosophy of Science, Cognitive Science, Frontiers in Psychology, Mind and Language, Minds and Machines, and many other journals. Dr. Paco Calvo, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while.
Yeah, well, thank you for your invitation.
Yeah, most definitely. Typically we start things off just by handing the guest the floor for a little bit to talk about themselves. If you could just take a few minutes to introduce yourself, sort of how you got involved in science and philosophy, and in this fascinating area of plant neurobiology. I think that'd be a great way to start things off.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, I guess we should get started with a little bit of an explanation as to how, being a philosopher in a philosophy department, you end up, toying with plants in a lab and doing the type of things we do, right? Yeah, I guess it's not easy to understand why we want to study plants. I mean, in philosophy, after all, we are interested about, understanding what we call like real cognition, right? The type of thing that we have the feeling that it belongs to us, right? And I guess even, now I'm going back to the good old times in the 90s when I was actually at UCSD finishing my PhD. And I was, really bothered by this idea as to, why are we really that special? I mean, what is it special about us, about Homo sapiens, right? And I was feeling, increasingly, suspicious that we were asking the wrong type of questions and there was something really wrong about the whole approach. And that took me to think, okay, let's try to think some other way, like let's try to think of other forms of life. I didn't want to get into artificial intelligence, and which is a whole different issue, and we would be opening different kind of worms. And I think that talking about plants is difficult enough. But within biological systems, some system which is like completely alien to us, something that looks like so different that we would never guess that they would, that they could be intelligent or something would be happening within them or something like that. And then let's try to scale up. Let's try to see how much we end up having in common, right? And that was what motivated me to get started with plants, because I thought, well, maybe they allow us in a sense to actually to put our finger into what's wrong with our attitude with respect to ourselves. So they have no neurons, they don't move around, they look like, they are sessile, and then we just don't quite see where cognition, where intelligence might reside within them, right? And then I thought, well, maybe cognition or intelligence never resides within any system whatsoever. So not even in the case of human fellows or other animals. Maybe we need to rethink the whole issue, right? So that brought me to, to think how to apply tools from the embodied cognitive science literature, like, trying to decentralize cognition, extend it out there. All these paradigms like are becoming fashionable, like talking about situated, extended, embodied, embedded cognition. Like, let's think about the non-neural aspects of human cognition, right? So that has to do with the body aspects, with the environmental interactions. And let's see if we could push a little bit harder, which is another twist, which is to say, okay, not just the body or the environment, but let's put the emphasis even within the system in those aspects which are non-neuronal. And plants have no neurons, yet they are alive and they are doing their things. So we thought, why not? Let's see what we can learn from them. So we are trying to learn about ourselves through plants, if I may say.
I like the expression on sort of on your website, the unnerving of intelligence, and you talk about obviously plants, they don't have nervous systems, and it makes me think of some of the other topics that we've gotten into on this show, whether it's things like social amoebas that they're single cell, they get together, they do all sorts of fancy things as multiple cellular structures, no brain, no nervous system, and then you have these sort of the other end. We sit here, as you were saying, we think we're sort of the top of the food chain because we got a couple pounds of stuff in here, but you look at the lowly octopus over here, it's got 9 brains and it has a totally different way of doing things. Talk a little bit, if you would, about sort of where we are in terms of sort of the non-neural domain, let's say, because we talked about single cell organisms. We talked, you're heavily focused on plants. We've also spent a little time on sort of this looking at the regenerators, who's things like flatworms that you destroy their brain, it grows back, and somehow miraculously intelligence, consciousness comes back. Have we gotten to this point of putting the nervous system or the central nervous system on such a pedestal when nerves and brains, for that matter, that were rather new in an evolutionary context? A lot of stuff went on this planet hundreds of millions of years before nerves and brains ever existed. Talk about this unnerving of intelligence, as you mentioned on the website a little more.
Yeah. I guess we are far too obsessed with labels, and the term neuro suddenly feels like there's something special about it. And then if you appeal to neural tissue, then that's neural tissue based, so no question about it. As if we were getting some understanding by the very fact of referring to that tissue, that type of tissue. And it's so funny. I find it's really funny. Actually, last week I was sending a quote to a colleague of mine. Now I don't have my laptop with me. I was telling you it crashed. I wish I could share that quote with you because I don't remember by heart. But it came to say something along these lines, like, if you're trying to find some physiological based correlate of some function, some cognitive trait or something, then if you spot something going on in your tube, then you say, well, say, so what? But something is happening. You can correlate it to some activity somewhere in the system, and if I pinpoint something, robust or solid correlation in some sort of tissue down there, then you would still, want to know more about it. But why that's relevant? What's explanatory about it? But then the burden of proof is on me because it's not neural tissue. Right. Now, if it was neural tissue, if I say, hey, this is the neural correlate of this cognitive trait, right? So I'm doing some neuroimaging, I can see something lighting up, and then it feels like the burden of proof disappears suddenly. Oh, now we have reached what? Some sort of explanation that we couldn't have otherwise. So what's so special about the correlate, the substrate being neuronal? I don't think there is anything special about it. And what I think we should do is if we redefine what we mean by nervous system or neuronal, and think of in a substrate neutral term way, right? Just forget about the substrate itself, the implementation, and then let's see, functionally speaking, about what is it that we are talking about. Are we talking about information processing? Right. Are we talking about the detection of signals, the transmission of those signals? What is it that we are doing with that information, right? Mm-hmm. Then what I think we are really getting wrong is that intelligence has nothing to do with the processing of information.
Okay.
So it's not about processing information. I think we got it really wrong from the computer sciences. And you know, the digital computer metaphor has made an awful amount of, you know, of damage, relying so heavily on the hardware software metaphor for the human mind. You know, like okay, we have some neural hardware, then there is this software running on top of this neural hardware, and we somehow have the feeling that, okay, we are following these rules implemented in this neural tissue, and somehow we think we can, you know, get past with that sort of analogy. But if you think, now just forget for a moment about the neural tissue. If you think, what do we truly mean about intelligence relating to the processing of information? Why is it information processing?
Right.
What could it be if not? And that's what I think is the critical issue, that we have the idea that the environment is not rich enough, is not providing the key, is not telling us what we should be doing, and somehow cognition, intelligence has to do with us enriching what's out there, like from the inside. So intracranially, in our head, we have somehow to enriching it because it's inherently poor. And we think that intelligence has to do with what we bring onto the problem. Oh, the problem is there, it's underspecified, there's nothing we can do about it because it's, you know, there's not enough information, then we enriching it by processing that information. It's as if we were at the wheel, we're sitting at the wheel, we do the information enriching process, and thereby something that was inherently poor becomes rich and full of mental blah, blah, blah. And that's what I think is wrong about it. Once we redefine what we mean by information processing, then we might think, oh, it's true. Being neuronal or not was not what was at stake. It was what actually mean by information in itself, right? So if you think about information processing in an ecological setting, then we have to go back, of course, as usual. I mean, there is not a single topic in cognitive science that you don't have to go back to Darwin, of course. Right. But other than Darwin, you have to go back to the ecological psychology literature in the 1960s and 70s and think, oh, as opposed by ecological psychology, I would like people to think as opposed to cognitive psychology or cognitive neuroscience, where the unit of analysis, the emphasis resides not in the organism in itself, but in the very coupling of the organism and the environment as such. So that's the one and only unit of analysis. We cannot analyze your cognition. I cannot go out there and see what's happening in your head and try to understand what's happening by looking inside your skull. Yep. So it's got to be by relating whatever behavior, the overt behavior I'm observing, I've got to relate it to the actual interaction that is taking place as you move around and interactions unfold in real time. So this couple system that takes the whole, in this case, the neural part of the body itself and the environment. Once we put it in those terms, in ecological terms, then we realize that information wasn't inherently poor. We weren't looking at it in the right way. Then if you think about how plants do it, right? Then you say, okay, we can skip the neuronal talk for the time being because we're interested in the coupling of the system itself. And let's see what the plant does. Oh, what the plant, just one of the plant models we use in the lab here, it's a vine, climbing bean. So the climbers, they have to, make their way to the host, to target, to trying around and reach out there to do photosynthesis. So we time lapse these plants and try to understand what's going on. And of course, if I tell my fellow, the plant physiologists, we quarrel a lot. They disagree with what we defend, of course, but because they don't approach plants from a coxsci perspective. They think of plants from a purely plant physiology perspective. Yeah. So of course they say, what are you talking about? I mean, of course we know the climbing, the vine is growing and eventually it reaches the pole. And they might even say they can sense, chemical gradients, they might sense light, and then that's the way they get there. But they will add, the plant is simply reacting to the environment. So the very same way you would explain a phototropic behavior, okay, the sun is there, they sense blue light, which provides informational cues, directional cues, and the plant turns toward the light as the potted plant you have on your windowsill is facing the window to reach the sun. So that's not really intelligent or anything, and I would agree with that, right? So we need to look for something else. And that has to do with the way, go back to the ecological idea, the way the plant is not growing in reaction to the source of light, but is actually modifying its phenotype. So it's growing and developing directionally in such a way that is generating information. So information is being generated in the very act, in the very interaction itself. So by moving around with respect to the environment, what you make is you create those opportunities of interaction. So you perceive what ecological psychologists like to say affordances, the affordance of interaction. So for example, the climbing being will perceive the affordance of climbability. It will perceive the support, the host tree or the trunk or the pole as this thing out there providing the potential interaction to climb onto. But that's not something, this is the critical issue. That's not something you can perceive just by sitting back and crunching all those operations in your head as if you were following a rule, this software we were talking about. So it's not rule following, it's not information processing. It's not, okay, I'm gonna process the information about the target, then I'm gonna compute how to reach for the target. Now, if that's the way we think about intelligence, of course, I'm not surprised plant physiologists disregard our approach because they don't get it. They think we are trying to make it computational, to treat it as a computational problem. But when you treat it as an ecological problem, it's not about the plants, but you don't need to think of anyone sitting at the wheel within the plant as we think in ourselves. Of course, that's a homunculus fallacy. It doesn't happen either in our case. Yeah. But in any organism whatsoever, you cannot have the cartoon version of some guy doing the numbers, the calculations to reach for the pole. In the very act of growing, you are generating the information that tells you, that prescribes you how to keep growing in order to exploit that type of informational flow. So it's a flow of energy. And that's, in fact, the very same type of explanation you find when you talk about the bacteria, following up, the chemical gradient to get to the sugar, or any form of life whatsoever relies on the way they are, interacting with the surroundings to generate that information, which pops up in the very interaction itself. So don't look inside the plant to try to think what the plant is up to, because the unit of analysis is the plant and the system, the environment, the local environment as such. Now, when you think in those terms, you realize that the environment wasn't that poor after all, and the plant didn't need to be doing any computations. And that's what I meant about, hey, by looking at this type of behavior and appreciating how sophisticated it is in its own terms, ecologically speaking, then we can rewind and say, hey, what lessons can we extract from this? Maybe we can learn a bit about ourselves. Maybe we are doing something similar to what the plant is doing. And now, in this type of comparison, now you realize that neurons becomes less and less important all the time, right?
Yep.
So that's what we try to do with time-lapse photography.
And, some of the things you were talking about just now, and I wanted to sort of go back to, you mentioned Darwin early on, and, just to give the audience some idea that, Darwin was thinking about this stuff too back in the 1800s, and this concept of the root brain, where you have this tremendous amount of biomass that none of us really think about. We see our plant on our windowsill, and that's all fine, but you got 10 times the biomass usually under the earth. Combined with that, you have sort of this entire ecosystem under there with the fungi and all the other organisms that communicate with the root systems. And then I think, this is where this concept of, and you can talk more about this, sort of this general Tao theory about sort of the interactions with the grander environment. And then you also bring up the concept of the integrated information theory, Dr. Toloni and others that talk about sort of properties of all types of physical systems that have enough complexity, let's say. Talk about these three areas, because I know they're sort of fundamental to sort of the different philosophies, let's say, that you think about when you think about plants.
Right. So, I mean, here we're opening two separate kinds of worms.
Okay.
And many people get mad at them both, right? But we can distinguish in between them.
Not me.
So one issue is cognition itself.
Yep.
So we can talk about plant cognition and people can go mad. But when we talk about plant consciousness or plant sentience, people can go mad for different reasons. And they don't need to be related to one another. So we could defend plant intelligence and yet think that plants are not sentient. Or we could defend both, that they are both intelligent and sentient. Or you can have any combination of those two. So one, of course, if you just let's get started with the very latest. So that was you mentioned integrated information theory, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have a paper now just came out in the latest issue of the Journal of Cognition Studies, and there we were actually defending the idea that we could kind of test experimentally. Mm-hmm. For the amount of information being integrated within plants.
Yep.
Right. So the idea is that in any system, forget about this type of substrate, just any system, physical system whatsoever, you might get or you might be able to gather to tell how much information gets integrated in such a way that we suspect that at that precise location is where consciousness resides. Mm-hmm. Right. Take apart one part and you lose something, and then you might see that. Well, think for example of anesthesia. I mean, when you anesthetize a subject, you can disrupt the type of information that is being integrated at a certain spatio-temporal location, and we might think of okay, what's happening here when you put a subject to sleep with anesthesia, right? And think when the guy comes out of anesthesia, what is it that it is recovering? What do you recover when you come out of the surgical room, right, after an operation? Okay. And that's a question we have never raised with respect to plants, and we raised it in this article on IIT theory. So we say, so imagine we mess up with plants to that extent, and we put them to sleep with anesthetics, which in fact we do actually. The very same type of anesthetics that you use to put a cow or a dog or a cat to sleep in a vet is the very same type, because the principles are exactly the same, right? Mm-hmm. So we are messing up with the membrane properties, and then we block the action potentials. So the cells actually, we prevent cells from firing. They don't fire action potentials, right? So, which by the way, sometimes people often confuse neural spikes, spikes of voltage with being neural. So plant cells fire spikes of voltage, right? So we can talk about plant action potentials. They are simply non-neural, but the properties, electrophysiologically speaking, are the same. So if we focus on the electrophysiological properties of the plant tissue, here we are talking about the vascular system, where all the flow is going through, informational flow, I mean. So we can treat the plant as an information processing system. Now, if you just allow me to, this usage of information processing, not in the computational sense, but in the sense of allowing this flow of information to go through the whole plant body, right? Then we can treat it ecologically. But information flows throughout the whole plant. Mm-hmm. Now, if we put a plant to sleep, then and then allow it to recover, to come out of anesthesia, we can actually observe what's happening there. So, for example, take a Venus flytrap that snapshots when you touch it, or a Mimosa pudica, the plant that it falls its leaves. If you touch it, the Mimosa pudica, you just touch it and it falls. So those plants, you don't even need to do time-lapse photography. You can watch it through the naked eye, right? Okay. So in these plants, you can actually, touch them, see how they shut or fold, and then you can put them to sleep. You just can put it into a glass bell and use some anesthetics and put it to sleep. And then you can see what happens when it recovers. And then you can make the very same type of questions like Tononi and colleagues would ask with respect to human and animal subjects in general. Say, hey, this sort of perturbation, what is it telling us about the amount of information being integrated and about the seat of that potential sentience, right, within the organism?
Sure.
And that's what we thought we could ask, not philosophically or metaphysically even, but experimentally. So we can actually do that. And that means that on top of putting the plant to sleep and allowing it to recover and see what's going on with time-lapse photography, we can actually register the electrophysiological activity. So we can see what fires, what direction energy flows goes, what connects with what. So what gets integrated and what doesn't, right? So I guess what we are trying to say is that if you have a robust methodology, you can apply, try, at least in principle, to apply to any system whatsoever without prejudices and preconceptions, because it's system neutral. The principles have to do with information and not with a particular type of substrate, right? Mm-hmm. So now one thing is important is that because when you, so for example, if people go and read this paper, then they will say, oh, Paco is defending that plant consciousness gets explained with IIT, Integrated Information Theory. And the answer is, hold on a sec. We would do a disfavor to simply privilege one approach over the rest. So my approach is plural, is to try, in fact, as many different paradigms as possible to see how much light we can throw from all different angles. So what we should do, what we should be doing is take all the theories of consciousness in the market, right? Those that, of course, are not tailor-made for humans. So, for example, those that don't rely on linguistic competencies or things like that. Of course, we don't want to anthropomorphize plants. So we want to take the type of theories that are wide enough to be in principle applicable to any system whatsoever that we suspect might be intelligent. Could be an octopus, could be invertebrates. You know, now people like to think about honeybees and octopuses and ant colonies and termites. Well, let's go to plants as well. And let's just think about it without prejudging the question. So it's not, we cannot disregard it on a priori grounds. That's all the claim, that's all we are saying. So if this is an empirical matter, we have empirical hypotheses that can get falsified. So let's try to falsify them, but that's the only way to go. We cannot do away with a theory just on a priori grounds. Let's make empirical hypotheses that can get falsified. What I'm saying it looks like really obvious, but we have to fight against, orthodoxy, because to many people, this is anathema. This is something we couldn't even discuss. Well, why not? Now, if you go to other theories of consciousness, then you might say, hey, what could other theories of consciousness have to offer? Well, from an activist approaches, from ecological approaches, from predictive processing, from many different frameworks. Some of them are reductionist, and then they will try to search for the plant-like neural correlate of consciousness. Right. Others will be extended and situated and won't care about that type of substrate. So we can go for more reductionist or less reductionist approaches. But the take-home message for me is, let's try them all. Let's try them all. So you'll find, if you check out our pubs in the site, in the MintLab site, you'll see that in different papers, we follow different routes, because we try to see how much progress can we make by following those threads from any of those paradigms. So that's as far as integrated information theory goes. Is one paradigm worth testing in the case of plants, but there are other ones that we shouldn't be ignoring, right? In a sense, to many, sentience or consciousness, has to do with life itself. Where you have life, you have mind. People like to say. This is an old saying from the 19th century, from the good old days of the founding of psychology as a discipline. And many people have endorsed that view. And Darwin, going back to Darwin, it's funny because Darwin was truly obsessed with plants, and yet people simply turned the blind eye to all his books on plants. If you think, if you ask the lay reader, the lay people in the street, that they would say, okay, just tell me about Darwin. Of course, that's the origin of the species. And the best and the most important work in Darwin is about botany. Yeah. And the take-home message, I mean, if there was one single message, one lesson from Darwin, was that botany does not subordinate to zoology. And then if you understand that literally, then you take seriously that message, then you see how much progress we can make much faster. Yep. Because we are stuck with terminological disputes. Sure. I mean, it took decades to talk about plant sex. Yep. Plants couldn't have sex because we were obsessed with keeping the label to ourselves. So get rid of the label, apply it across the board. Yep. How do you mean plants don't have sex? How do you mean plants don't have hormones? Hormones, that was another label that was difficult to reconquer for plants. And it's so funny because all these labels, if you go to the history of science, all the research we have been gaining in zoology and psychology, it eventually came from botany. Then it was adopted by psychology or by zoologists, but in the origin, it was usually botanical research. But then we have to fight back and say, hey, we have to go, excuse me, knock on their door and say, hey, can we use the label as well? Excuse me, it's not just yours, right? Yeah. But it's risky, this what I'm saying, because people might think, well, you're making, too much hassle, too much about the label. Just use another label, and no, that's a mistake, because it's not about the usage of the label. It's about the underlying universal principle that we are missing by not putting them all in the same basket. So it's not something because I just want to use the label and then if you don't let me use it, I cry. And no, it's that you will miss that in the tree of life, you have to go back to the stump, to the very base, to the bottom of the tree of life to understand it. Otherwise, you're going to miss it. You're going to think that we are doing something special up here, this end of this branch where hominids are. And no, then you are not understanding what the tree of life tells us, is trying to tell us. So all these strategies have to do with something that goes way back to unicellular life. Mm-hmm. I mean, and we are missing it all. So Darwin was part of it. IIT was part of it, and then you mentioned a third leg. I forgot.
The Tau theory.
Right. So in the case of Tau, actually, I love this story because it goes back to 4 or 5 years ago. I was on sabbatical in Edinburgh. I was penning a book on plant intelligence, and is coming out this year. And so still 5 years later, still work in progress, but almost done. But when I went to Edinburgh, I was collaborating with Dave Lee. Dave Lee, now he's an emeritus professor in psychology. He's the father of Tau theory, right? So it was a privilege to be able to brainstorm with him on our first day beers. And we used to go to the very cliffs where he used to, in the late 70s, early 80s, he has this paper in 1981, I think, in Nature, it was called Plummeting Gannets, right? Okay. So if you think of gannets, these ocean birds plummeting to catch fish in the Northern Ocean. Yep. So those were the gannets plummeting to catch fish in the Firth of Forth by Edinburgh, the coastline in Edinburgh, right? So Dave Lee in those days was there observing the gannets and thinking, how can we account for what's going on here in a way that makes sense, not just for us, but also for non-human animals? So this was a difficult task because you were thinking of, look, the gannet is plummeting, it's making like 60 miles an hour. It's plummeting from 100 yards or something. I'm making the numbers up, but it's plummeting real high, just plummeting to catch the fish. And it's got to be real precise when retracting its wings. So it have to retract the wings before entering the water, otherwise it's gonna be splashed onto the surface of the water. And if it retracts its wings far too early, it will miss control and the catch. So it's got to fine tune it. It's got to really go for it. Just go, plummet, and boom, retract the wings, catch the fish. So Dave was there and watching them, and he thought, He had been doing some research earlier that in the 70s for the UK traffic administration for road, car drivers,
Sure.
like, how you stop, how you push the brake and don't jump the red lights or the stop signal or something. So how you control the braking in the car and to brake smoothly, to stop smoothly and these sort of things. And of course, all this was based on optic flow, right? So we were talking that the unit of analysis was the organism environment system as such, right?
Yep.
So this means that we cannot think of information as snapshots, as pictures in your retina.
Sure.
So we cannot be thinking, okay, I take a picture of my retina, okay, I process that snapshot, then I process the next snapshot, then I process the next snapshot, then I have an idea of what's going on. That's computational, that's static, that's anything but dynamical, anything but a flow of real information. That's not the way to go. So we need to be thinking about movement itself. That's why the emphasis is in movement as such. So in fact, Dave's institute in Edinburgh was called the Perception Movement Action Research Consortium. So the emphasis was on how you close the perception action loop by putting the emphasis on movement as such. So if I'm getting close to the webcam, you see my image is expanding on the retina. If I move backwards, the image is shrinking. So this is providing information as to how we are interacting with each other. If I'm getting too close, I know I'm gonna collapse. Now, what's relevant, not how you compute information about the snapshots in sequence, but about how you deal by interacting with your surroundings with the optic flow itself. So in this case, the relative rate of change. So how the rate of change of the image on your retina, the image size, how it's expanding or contracting as I move away or towards the target. So as I'm moving towards something, the image gets bigger, 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 bigger. And that relative rate of change, how fast this is changes, it's changing with respect to how I'm doing, is telling you something that you have to brake faster or brake slower. And then I just make it just like, okay, so I keep holding my foot on the brake, okay, right on time. I brake just at the traffic red lights, didn't jump them, right? So something similar. So it's a nicely fine-tuning of how you are, perceiving for acting and acting for perceiving. So you are closing this perception action loop. So by moving with respect to the environment. So put it this way. If the plummeting gannet had to freeze in midair, pull out a pocket calculator and make the calculations as to, okay, I'm doing 60 miles an hour, 100 yards left, I need to stop in 2 seconds, then you don't make it. You make it by forgetting about the pocket calculator, forgetting about making computations, and simply acting and resonating, allowing for this energy flow, this flow of information on your retina, this optic flow, to resonate within the system and allowing this to calibrate itself. Of course, it requires learning, training, experience, but that's what happens with any sort of organism whatsoever. We get better at doing things, not by sitting back and computing, but simply by keep doing things, right? So if you think of the eye, the information in the retina of the plummeting gannet as similar to the information that the driver acquires by driving towards the traffic signal or driving away from the side of the road or whatever. So these optic flows that you are generating, that are being generated by interacting with the surroundings, things stay in the middle, other things disappear on the periphery, right? So, and they do it at different paces. So if you are able to keep track of all those energy flows, then you realize that in the same way that we were saying there is nothing special about tissue being neuronal, right? Plants have tissue that is non-neuronal and still they fire spikes of voltage. We can say the same with respect of optic flow, because plants, of course, they have no eyes the way we do. But the interesting thing about flow is not that it's optic. Optic flow is the easiest example because you can picture it, like me getting closer to the screen, to the webcam, this thing we were doing. But it happens with respect to any form of energy flow whatsoever. So energy flows don't need to be optic. Could be haptic, could be about, you know, how I feel pressure on my skin surface. Could be chemical. Remember the bacteria and the chemotaxis example. Bacteria, you know, swimming up a chemical gradient. So any energy flow whatsoever is informative insofar as you can relate it to your own doings. So I'm doing something, and this something I'm doing has an effect on how the energy flow impinging on my sensory surfaces change. By moving this direction, something happens to the optic flow. By moving in this direction, something happens to the optic flow. Things shrink or expand differentially, depending on how I move. So you can relate what happens to those energy flows as you behave. That's why the unit of analysis is the whole thing. You cannot separate the two. So if you get them together as the ecological unit of analysis, and forget that the flows need to be optical, and forget that the system within the body need to be neuron-based, so you can think of how those energy flows resonate throughout the plant body, throughout the vascular system of the plant, then we have the very same principles on a different substrate, complete different substrate, but the same principle. And that's why it's so important to realize that plants, despite being rooted, are not sessile as we think they are. So plants, so put it this way. Remember, we were saying, okay, we should make an effort to test things that are falsifiable. Okay, if plants didn't move, I would agree they couldn't be intelligent, because intelligence requires movement. But movement itself is not within the organism. It belongs to the unit of analysis, the ecological unit of analysis. So I don't need to be approaching the webcam. The webcam could approach me. Like you see, like you have the effect of collapsing onto a wall in gamers. Like gamers are playing a video game and they have because the thing on the screen is making bigger. You have the feeling that it's making the same effect. It's something is expanding on your retina, and you are sitting on your gamer chair, right? So movement is not something I do. It belongs to the interaction itself. But what's critical is the type of energy flows that are being generated in that interaction. So that's what we are trying to measure. When we talk about analyzing in ecological tau terms, plants, what we are doing is not metaphorically, that's what I said, it's not the fight over labels, not metaphorically, but literally, we are trying to apply the same tools to analyze the endogenous control, how the plant controls the way it grows towards the pole, in the very same way that the plummeting gannet controls the way it retracts its wings prior to reaching the surface of the ocean to catch the fish, or the driver prior to get into the red light or the stop signal. So the plant is doing the same. Now think about it. Think of now it's a pity I don't have here my foot. I could show you some footage. So imagine just, you see the climbing beam, circumnutating, which by the way, this is a term we owe to Darwin. Darwin coined this expression, circumnutate. So it's nutating around in circles. That's how a climbing beam grows in search of a potential host. So the climbers, what they do is they sacrifice energy, the type of energy a big tree would devote to making a solid basement and grow rigidly. They grow very weakly, but very fast, with an eye to catching somewhere else to use as scaffolding. So they rely on the fast perception of some host that they can latch on and then twine around to make it up there, right? So this means that they can't afford to miss it. So at the earliest stages of development, they cannot afford to miss it, because otherwise they're going to be in the shade. They won't be able to go out there and spread their solar panels, right? So they need to say, no, I cannot miss it. So I cannot miss it. Our working hypothesis is that it doesn't simply mean I want to simply grow, and if I'm lucky, eventually I will bump onto some guy and I will twine around him, right? So it's not I'm gonna see if just by growing I just bump onto something and then react mechanically to this thing I touched and then I flying around. No, we believe that there is perception at a distance, so that the plant is detecting the potential host and controlling the pattern of growth in such a way that it optimizes. We're talking about the succeed, and if they are passing their genes, if vines, climbers are so successful, by the way, evolutionarily speaking, they are incredibly successful. If they are so successful, they can rely on this sort of chance. Oh, lucky me, I bumped into some guy. No, they've got to be able to, they have evolved the type of adaptations that allow them to recognize those potential hosts. Now, what we are adding to this, of course, Darwin knew all this. So we are not saying anything new here. What's new, what we are bringing to the discussion is we are putting together Darwin with this ecological Tao theory or this Gibsonian ecological principles. We say, no, it's not just Darwin. We need to put together Darwin and ecological psychology. And by doing so, we can understand how it's not just, of course, the plant is trying hard to reach the pole. It didn't simply bump onto it by accident. It meant it. And here I'm not anthropomorphizing. By meant it, I simply mean there is some proactive behavior. Not simply reactive, but proactive behavior. So they are planning ahead of time. Now, if you say planning ahead of time, cognitive psychologists will say, who is doing the planning? Nobody is doing the planning, because nobody is doing the planning in the human case either.
Yeah.
So we are just saying, ecologically speaking, that the plant, by circumnutating around, is generating the type of information, is generating the type of energy flows that are rich enough. Remember, we said the environment is not inherently poor.
Sure.
It appears to be poor if you are a couch potato. But if you are moving around, the environment is not poor. It's all these things are popping up, all these opportunities of interaction. Then you start perceiving affordances. I can afford climbability, I can afford stepability, I can move up there and pull my leg, I can afford stoppability at the traffic signal, I can afford fish catchability if I'm a gannet. So all these affordances, the possibilities of interaction that all organisms are able to perceive, have to do with the interaction and the generation of energy flows that are informative enough insofar as you are actively engaging with your surroundings. Darwin saw the engagement. Now we need to add the ecological, we need to think of engagement through an ecological lens. That's the way to combine them both.
Very interesting. Yeah. Very interesting.
That's kind of the game we play here.
No, it's fascinating, and once again, the reason I brought up Darwin, well, you brought it up, but really want to understand that people, including Darwin, were thinking about this over a century ago, and now sort of reconnecting with some of these tools that we have in 2021, extremely important for sort of building on the models. At the laboratory, you mentioned the pea plants and the climbing beans. Obviously, we have 300,000 or so, varieties of plants out there. Not all of them like to climb and do that type of stuff. There's those that are really good at, synthesizing wide ranges of phytochemicals, and others that are, aquatic plants that do their thing and so forth. Talk a little bit about some of what you look at in the lab, aside from the sort of the climbing and the sensing component there. Do you look at sort of the chemistries? What are some of the other things that you're interested in the laboratory?
Right. So there are two issues here, right? One thing is that it's good you mentioned these plant models we use, because there is a risk that people pay attention to the flashy behaviors of the fast and furious, right?
Right.
So like people like to talk about Venus flytrap, they like to talk about mimosa, they like to talk about all these the ones that are, that they are making these things that are like jaw-dropping, right?
Yeah.
And we sort of tend to ignore the guys that are more boring, this little grass, they are doing nothing. And it's funny because those other guys that we think do nothing, do a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And the problem is that up until now, we have only thought of what is it that they do in plant physiology terms.
Yeah.
So the plant model per excellence is Arabidopsis, right?
Yeah.
So Arabidopsis is just a little grass. It's physiologically speaking, it's not that interesting, but it's good to have a simple model, of course, for obvious reasons. In biology, we like to think of a good simple model, and we learn a lot from that. That's certainly the case. We've learned a lot from Arabidopsis. But we might be either making one of these two mistakes. One is thinking that we should be doing with plants, with any species whatsoever, what we have done so far with Arabidopsis, that is to say, mainstream physiology, and go to unearth, the molecular, the cellular, the signaling pathways, and all the nuts and bolts at that level of description. And once you've done that, end of the story. And that's a problem for obvious reasons from what we've said before, right? I mean, it's a problem just to think of what's happening within the subject and not in relation to the environment. Yep. So we would be missing everything, I would say. So physiology, in mechanistically speaking, or in reductionist terms, I think is necessary. It's necessary, of course. We need to understand the physiology, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient, right? So one type of mistake is to think, okay, any plant you bring to the lab, let's just follow the protocols that we learn from the plant physiology guys, and that once you do that, then they okay, do the genomics, do the basic physiology. Once you've settled all that, then you're all set. You are done. No, but on the other hand, we could do the opposite mistake, to think that we should be looking for behaviors that are appealing, that are attractive to our eye. Yeah. And that is a problem. That is a problem because we might be anthropomorphizing plant behavior. Yeah. And we don't need to be obsessed with comparing them to us. We don't need to compare them to us. Right. We would be misunderstanding, again, the tree of life. So just to give you an example of what I said before, even when I talk about the circumdation, the pattern of circumdation of the climbing bean, we have some video, some footage where it looks, pretty spectacular. Like you see the trying, to reach the pole and shift. You see how the shape is shifting. It looks like goal-oriented, and then that can be biasing your research in dangerous ways, because we might be thinking, hey, the plant is got to be doing something that that looks interesting from an animal perspective. So if you think of an animal trying to reach something, okay, I'm an animal trying to grab the mug. So grabbing the mug, I need to do this, and then we tend to think of animals like reaching for objects effortlessly, like doing this type of approaching maneuvers, and we sort of try to find that same type of signature in plant behavior in order to infer that there is some sort of intelligence underneath it, behind it, and that's a mistake. So why couldn't it be the case that the type of plant behavior that is truly intelligent, it doesn't resemble animal behavior at all? So imagine I'm a climbing bean. I could be circumnutating, right? I could be like this, no? Like circles. Those circles might not need to go elliptical to understand it in goal-directed terms, because to understand it in goal-directed terms, we think, okay, this circular pattern will become elliptical to target the pole. We might say, why? Imagine now, sometimes I've been watching climbing beans to the naked eye to avoid the type of biases that we bring with time-lapse footage, right? Because think what was happening with time-lapse. When you are time-lapsing a plant, you are speeding it up. So we take like people usually take like 5 minutes, a picture every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. We do every minute, right? So a picture every minute is quite a lot. So we can gather a lot of data. Then we assemble the footage like 24 frames per second. So just think the amount of information you have in 2 minutes of footage, which is like 3 days of 3 days for plant time, right? The plant, a climbing being reaching for the pole, those 3 days and nights become 2.5 minutes on footage, right? But this is risky because by assembling this footage at that pace, we are trying to see something with our own signature. We're trying to speed it up to our own pace. And the type of bias has to do with saying, hey, could it be the case that the plant is smart enough, for example, as in perceiving at a distance the pole, and thereby, rather than freaking out and saying, I've got to go for it, chilling out and saying, hey, I don't need to get overexcited. I only need to keep growing because eventually I will get it just by growth and development. So we might be putting too much stress onto interpreting their behavior, when their solution might be not simpler but different, because we have to think of plants from their own perspective and not from our perspective, right? So this means that let's be careful with Arabidopsis and think of toy physiological models, and let's be careful with the flashy behaviors and think of them in our own terms. So the type of tools we have in the lab you were asking about, on top of time-lapse photography, we do time-lapse plants, but try to think hard of how not to fall prey of those anthropomorphic biases.
Right.
And at the same time, we are starting to perform electrophysiological recordings. So we insert the electrodes into the stem, and we register the electrical activity, those flows of energy within the vascular system. In the very ecological sense we were talking about before. So that's what I meant by talking about how those flows resonate within the system. So now, if we can track the resonance of those energy flows, right, as they get transduced and transmitted throughout the vascular systems, throughout the whole plant body, then we have a very powerful tool, because on top of having the footage that we can watch to the naked eye, and we are careful not to overinterpret it, then we can see what's happening electrochemically within the plant. So we can see what fires where. Then we can talk about those patterns of integrated information, right? So we can equate like the actual perception of the pole and the controlling of the approaching maneuver to those electrical signatures. Now, combining electrophysiology with time-lapse footage, we have a much more powerful technique of observation than taking those two by themselves in isolation, right? But on top of those two tools, then you can still think of, okay, it's not just about plants moving around. We miss many things. Think of stomata opening or closing, like stomata in the underneath of the leaves.
Sure.
So you might be, you have guard cells that like are making them open or close at will, depending on how stressed they are, or what is it that they need to take or leave into the environment. So those are doors that connect the plant as well with respect to the environment. And we sometimes don't pay enough attention to those cues. Of course, you pay attention to them from a plant physiology perspective, but our emphasis is we need to look at plants from a cocci perspective. So don't think, I know the story. I mean, you can take just any plant physiology textbook and go for the explanation of what's happening there in the guard cells, to control the opening and closing of the stomata. You can have an understanding of the hydric stress, what's happening with respect to relative humidity, to day-night cycles, to all the... You can have a good understanding of all that. Right. But if you don't ask the questions from a psychological perspective, from the perspective of the cognitive sciences, then you are missing the plot. Right. You are just simply doing physiology. And I don't mean simply as if it was something simple to do. I mean simply as if you're doing something that is necessary, but is not sufficient by any means.
Yeah. Getting a little more esoteric now. In 2017, you wrote this piece in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. What is it like to be a plant? Modeled on the Thomas Nagel book, and you know. Obviously, this is a subjective thing that we as humans cannot know at this point in time. But it makes you wonder. Well, I have two questions behind this one. Obviously, the plant kingdom has given us, aside, we were mentioning, aside from a wealth of healthcare products and nutritionals, calories and so forth, it has given us a wide range of consciousness-altering substances as well. And plants have to make these for, what they make them for, obviously slightly different than what humans may use them for, but whether it's to get, move that deer away or tell that mosquito not to come, whatever. There's a variety of ecological things going on with the plant. It's run with this one in any way that you want to, but when you're hanging out, having a couple glasses of wine or whatever, and you think about, what is it like to be a plant? What do you think about? And then second to that, do you think through some of these mind-altering, consciousness-altering substances that plants love to produce for us, well, not for us, but for themselves, there may be some hidden answers, I guess, in those visionary experiences, possibly. And once again, esoteric question, but run with that as you will.
Yeah. Wow. I'm not sure I want to say anything about the second question.
Okay, you don't have to.
No, I'll explain what I mean. Let's take the first question first, right?
Sure.
Then I'll try to say something, but I think that's that's the source of a lot of unnecessary controversy. Let's put it that way. So I think things would be easier if both parties wouldn't get so excited with the discussion about these type of substances and how they enhance our abilities or what they might be doing in their case.
Sure.
Anyway, so let's think first about the effort we need to make when trying to put ourselves in the shoes of a plant.
Yes.
Right? What is it like to be a plant? I know that when I wrote that paper, I knew that was going to be well received by some, let's say, one type of audience, and very badly received by mainstream.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. But one thing that worries me is, I would like to, this is something actually, I'm having a lot of headache now, like jotting down the book, in trying to convey this message in a way that appeals to both readerships, to the skeptics and to the sympathizers. So I would like the sympathizer to be more skeptical.
Okay.
And I would like the skeptical to be more open-minded. Okay, let's put it this way.
Sure.
So let's put it this way. I find something, I find uneasy when you don't need to make any effort to provide arguments to someone who wants to believe already in plant intelligence prior to understanding what the problems are.
Got it.
I think there is a problem with that. And I think there is a problem with the other party insofar as any argument you put on the table, they will say no, come what may. They will never consider the scientific debate as an intellectual, genuine debate, right? And here in What is it like to be a plant, I was trying, or I don't know if I succeeded or not, I guess I didn't, but I was trying to reach out to those two audiences and think in different terms. So this is not a matter of dogma. I'm not appealing to any will on your behalf, but simply to the type of intellectual effort you will have to do anyway when you put yourself in the shoes of any other fellow human or fellow animal, right? So remember what we said before about IIT and theories of consciousness?
Yep.
We said, well, it's nothing special about IIT. We could just try to play with the tools that different approaches have to offer. And let's see how far we can go with all those theories. Here is a little bit the same. Well, what is it that you do when you try to develop empathy with respect to somebody else? Because obviously you can only put literally in your own shoes, and not even that, So best case scenario, you put yourself in your own shoes. And if we are generous enough, with a bit of charity, you might put yourself in the shoes of fellow or your colleagues or people close enough to you, so that you feel secure enough to be able to think, no, I know pretty well what is it like to be my colleague, my friend, my partner, whatever. And then when we play this game of developing empathy, and now we'll talk about that, how do you develop that empathy? But when you play that game, then you go down or move away from Homo sapiens gradually. And then you say, okay, let's look at those guys who are closer to us, of course, mammals. And then you go for your pet, cat or dog, and then other mammals. And then even within mammals, you get to try to put yourself in the shoes of people who are, or guys, who are sufficiently dissimilar to you so that the effort, the intellectual effort is bigger, and yet they are still mammals. So you have the feeling that you still share something. So the bat. So a mammal with wings. So what is it like to be a bat? Well, it's a pretty weird mammal, but yet it still is a mammal, right?
Yep.
So you can think, okay, they have a neocortex. They somehow will be doing their stuff in their brain similarly to the way we do. Of course, now we know that we shouldn't be doing that because that's falling prey of the computer metaphor. But it's not about computing with your neocortex. But anyway, we have the feeling that it's easier to put yourself in the shoes of a mammal, even a bat, than in the shoes of a sponge. Sponge, or just to go for the the farthest away in terms of sessile, not showing pretty much activity, whatever. Yeah. Now, the more we know about other people, non-mammalian animal life forms, the more we know about them, scientifically speaking, I mean, the easier we think it is to develop that type of empathy. So now, the more we know about cephalopods, the more we are impressed by their capacities. And the same goes with invertebrates. I mean, I'm amazed with the amount of literature I told you on honeybees and other invertebrates. And the more we learn about what they can do, the more we feel that, okay, I know what I mean when I say that they learn. I know what I mean when I say that they memorize. So they are storing information that they can use at a later time, things like that. Now, I wouldn't like to use those labels because from an ecological psychology perspective, we don't store information. There is not a drawer where you have information being stored that you can retrieve at will and do computations with that information. That's not how things work.
Yep.
It's energy flows, resonating, non-stopping, all these flows we were talking about. But still, the closer they are and the more impressed we are as we keep gathering more data that allow us to infer, to suspect that there might be intelligence, genuine intelligence behind their overt behavior, then we say, well, maybe we can picture what it's like to be those guys, right? And then I as a thought experiment, I try to keep stretching that, like, to keep playing that game all the way down, not down, but spreading it all over the branches of the tree of life.
Yep.
Okay, let's see what these other guys, what it would be like to be like them. And then if you, as we said, if we think that we should redefine what we mean by nervous system and say, well, it's about, the electrochemical flows of information, traveling throughout the whole vascular system of the plant. We shouldn't get overexcited with the tissue being neuronal. Then you start to think, oh, they are doing their stuff. Then you realize when we say that they learn, we mean it, not metaphorically, but literally, they learn. So they are able to change, to modify their behavior as a result of the exposure to their surroundings. So that they don't just respond in a genetically predetermined manner. So they are modifying their behavior, and that has to do with what they've been exposed to in the past. Now we can say, we can use all those psychological terms, and we are not anthropomorphizing in doing so. So maybe what it takes is just some mental effort as to how to accomplish it. Now, the other week, this is something I'm talking about in the chapter I'm writing right now, and I talked to Paul Churchland, the professor of philosophy at UCSD. He was my supervisor when I was there visiting in the 90s, and 20 plus years later, I recall so vividly one lecture he gave this grad class. And he was telling us about something that really stuck to my mind. And that's something I wanted to use now. And I wrote to him after 20-something years, we hadn't been in touch. I said, hey, Paul, remember me? Can you remind me about this example you gave in this lecture? And I loved it. And I was lucky enough to get the line from him once again. So now it's again fresh in my mind. So that's good that you asked that question about that paper, because in that paper, I was using that. But not as much as I could have. And the idea Paul Churchland, he was telling us about, was he was reminding his own experience as he was moving from Canada to the US. At the time, they were changing from Fahrenheit to Celsius, right? So if you are a native speaker of Fahrenheit or a native speaker of Celsius, then it comes naturally to you, right? So now I would say, oh, it looks like, 18 degrees Celsius. Lucky us, we live in the Mediterranean. Okay. So in February, now it's 18, 20, right? And I don't, I might be 1-2 degrees off, up or down, but, not that much off. And I don't have the feeling I need to do any effort. It comes really naturally. Right. But we forget that it's something we've learned. We didn't come with Celsius in our genes. Right. And then Paul, he played this game of shifting gradually from Celsius to Fahrenheit or vice versa, right? So he would keep this chart of this correspondence table in his pocket. Like from 20 Celsius is whatever Fahrenheit, like that for any pair whatsoever of values, right? So he would just keep it in his pocket for a year or so, and he would pull it out every time he needed to think about the temperature, and then just check it naturally, what came to his mind in his natural system, and then translate it following the correspondence rule to the other system, and then gradually, very gradually, little by little, he would end up realizing that he didn't need to pull it out any longer out of his pocket to check the temperature. And he became a native speaker of the second system, right? So that's something that with a little bit of effort and patience is something you can develop. And what's important here is that what you need is a metric. You need a space where you can locate points, right? So if you have a few landmarks that you have set in stone, that they are already in place, then the path in between those landmarks is something that you can guess, infer. So you don't simply learn by heart all the actual possible values. What you develop is the competency to be proficient with a metric space. And you end up being able to navigate it as you would do if you were a natural speaker, right? So if we are born and we forget that all we call native is the result of learning in the early stages of childhood, and apply the same methodology to any parameter space, then we can see that we can apply the same correspondences to just taking physics, any two variables that you can convert to one another system. You can just use it for any pairwise comparison. And if you do that, you can end up becoming a native speaker of something that can be really, really, really cumbersome or really awkward to the naked eye as a first impression. So you could be talking about kinetic energy, you could be talking about in joules, you could be talking about any other magnitude in any system with any unit whatsoever, as long as you can keep track of those correspondence tables that take you from one to the next. the landscape, the metric space of that landscape is what counts. Then you can move progressively, gradually, to increasingly more awkwardly, spaces that you wouldn't envisage you might become proficient with. Now, if you think about it, it's something that has to do with scientific understanding. This is a bit, again, going back to what Paul was teaching us, it a bit has to do with doing away with those folk conceptions that we inherited from psychology, and go for a more technical understanding of what's underneath. So if we have a good, mature plant neurobiology, right? Now the field we work in, you introduced it as plant signaling and behavior, also known as plant neurobiology. Many people don't like the label plant neurobiology because of this neurotalk. Right. Now, if we understand it, how we can redefine it and relate it to any system processing information whatsoever, then the label is not harmful. But if you don't like the label, you can still talk about plant signaling and behavior. Now, if you talk about plant signaling and behavior, and you have a good, mature understanding of the electrophysiology and the signaling pathways and what's happening within the plant, not from a physiological perspective, but from a cognitive science perspective, as the plant is doing what it's doing, be it closing or opening stomata, reaching for a pole, changing rate of photosynthesis, shade avoiding. Patterns of shade avoidance are very interesting because they relate on how they perceive different ratios, like the ratio of red to far red light. So they can tell the ratio, the amount. Incidentally, this is very interesting because it's the very same example we said with the plummeting gannet. So if you have the amount of red light and the amount of far red light in isolation, just if you sense red light or you sense far red light, you don't have information which is giving you any cue. But if you are able to sense the ratio of red to far red light, then you have a great tool, because plants are absorbing red light and are letting far red light go through. So that means that the ratio of red to far red is providing a cue as to the amount of neighbors in the vicinity. So the density of the neighborhood. So that's by sensing the ratio of red to far red light, they are able to say, okay, I'm growing in this direction, and by growing in this direction, this ratio is dropping, or by growing in this direction, this ratio is going up. So now you see, like with the plummeting gannet, we play the same game of expanding the image on the retina. So I grow in this way, and by moving in this way, I see that the result is the ratio of red to far red light going down or going up. And as a result, I move in such and such a way. I grow in such and such a way. So when we have an understanding of what's happening here, again, not from the physiology, but from the cognitive sciences, from an ecological psychology perspective, then we have the tools to put ourselves in their shoes. Now we can see what is it like to be a plant, because we understand what the plant is up to. The plant is playing the game of cold, cold, hot, hot. I don't know if in English you say that. In Spanish we say caliente, frío. Like when you are approaching something that you're getting to the treasure, okay, hot, 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 or cold, cold. Like, so the ratio of red to far red light, okay, it's dropping, it's dropping, it's dropping, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. So you move one way or another, depending on whether you want to search for the empty space without competency from your neighbors, or you want to go where it's more dense, right? So if you have the scientific understanding of what's happening there, and do away with those folk notions that we were using in the first place, sure, from this, naive folk psychology, then we are able to fill in the gaps in that metric space that is allowing us to think in Celsius when we were initially educated to think in Fahrenheit, or vice versa, right? So this is a long story to say that putting ourselves in the shoes of some other species or some other fellows has to do with scientific knowledge, first of all, and always think that those shifts have to have always to be performed really gradually. So we cannot just go in one, of course it's a long jump, but we cannot just go in one shot.
Sure.
It's got to be always something really gradual, really gradual, really gradual. And when you do that, well, we know it. I mean, we know we are already applying this trick to understand or to put ourselves in the shoes of cephalopods, squid, yep, octopuses, and the like of invertebrates. We just need to, once we do away with those prejudices against non-animal life forms, we understand that the trick, the game we play is the same. It's just a different guy we are trying to understand.
Yep.
But the rules of the game are the same, right? So maybe this was a long story just to make you forget about your second question. But
no, it's really good.
No, please go.
No, it's really fascinating listening to this and just thinking of this domain and how much there is to explore.
Yeah, definitely.
Even though it's it's just like the theoretical physicist that sits there and thinks of the cosmos. I mean, here's another type of cosmos, let's say, that it's smaller, but it's a whole. You really it really takes an elegant way of looking at things to appreciate.
So in the case of psychoactive substances and things like this, I think what worries me is that it's very easy to get overexcited and to fall prey of subjective biases.
Sure.
Of the sort. So you know what I try real hard, first because I'm a philosopher of science. So I mean, when I teach, actually in this very classroom tomorrow morning. So I teach tomorrow morning. I'm telling my students, my undergrads, about cognitive biases, and I will be using the example of the time-lapse footage to say, hey, I know when I show them the footage, they get mad about it. Oh yeah, wow, look at the climbing me. Say, hey, hold on, easy, chill out. Now, in our case, we've got to be extra cautious, and that's something I keep telling my fellows, because when the type of phenomenon you are after is so extraordinary. We know in philosophy of science, epistemically speaking, that you need to have extraordinary evidence. So really robust evidence that allows you to make the case to say, hey, we have here something. This is not a false positive. This is not something we have overinterpreted or misinterpreted. This is a phenomenon, a robust enough phenomenon, and we are dealing with something here. Now we can explain it. But so we have to be extra careful, because otherwise, if we rush results and rush interpretations and get overexcited, then the orthodox plant physiologist that we said was skeptical will say, hey, did you see that? I was telling you.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm very concerned about getting solid and robust results and trying to understanding that the burden of proof in this case is on my side, because we do require very robust evidence.
Sure.
Now, so that's important. Now, what happens in the case of psychoactives, or for example, the relation of plants to humans? Very probably, plants don't care about us. Evolutionarily speaking, I mean.
Sure.
They care about insects, invertebrates, pollinators. Mm-hmm. They care about herbivores. So we need to think in evolutionary terms. Who are the guys they've been, having to deal with and co-evolving with? So of course you couldn't think of flowering plants and pollinators without the other. That's something Darwin, of course, taught us. And the same goes with respect to any other pattern of interaction in, evolutionarily speaking. Mm-hmm. But by this, so probably they care less about us than we would like to think, right? But But more importantly, well, go back to the case of anesthetics. I mean, plants synthesize those substances. I mean, we know. I mean, if you go to the pharmacy, the list has no end. The list of things we extract from plants,
Sure.
To our benefit. And we understand, we have a good molecular understanding of the effect that those substances have on us, both clinically or medically or cognitively, or for medical remediation or for fun, whatever, any usage you do of those drugs. But when we say that plants synthesize them, anesthetics, for example, we don't need to think by default that if we use these anesthetics not to feel pain, so when the doctor puts us to sleep with these anesthetics, and okay, now I can take you to the surgical room and then you won't feel pain. We don't need to think that because this substance was biosynthesized by a plant in the first place, they use it for the same purpose. That would be, I think that's funny because we keep complaining that we haven't understood, the Ptolomeo, Copernicus, thing like okay, we tend to think, we know we are not the center of the universe, but at the same time, we can't help thinking we are in some way. So no, evolution is not thinking about us. We are not anything special. But very probably, if it's a byproduct, the capacity to biosynthesize or has some specific aim for plants, it could be, or very plausibly is completely unrelated to the way we use it or to the things we think it's useful for. That's the analogy, that's the equivalent to thinking that if we animals grab the pole by lassoing around, the climbing being will only reach for it by lassoing the way we do. And we were saying, well, maybe they do it completely differently. No, maybe they perceive it and say, well, chill out. I can just grow and I will get it because I only need some patience. In 3 days' time, I will be there, right? Yeah. The one and only mistake, I think, is to think by default that they've got to be stupid simply because they are rooted. Yeah. And as we said before, if things boil down to movement, because it's the way you generate information, interaction, the plummeting gunner, the driver, then we just simply need to have enough flexibility, mental flexibility ourselves to understand what it takes for a plant to generate that information for itself, not using your schema. So all in their case, the way they grow, the way they develop, the way their cells differentiate, and the meristematic tissues is providing the new tip at the root tip or at the shoot tip, how they are making these primary and secondary growth patterns, and how they are selecting different roots to grow around, both below and above ground. We just need to think from an information processing perspective that they are exploiting that resource for the sake of generating information. By no means they've got to be doing it in a way which is like a small version, a proto version of what we do. We just need to forget about ourselves when we think of them, and just need to think of them for their own sake. Which, by the way, just one tiny, sorry, but because I said this and I thought, oh, this is just because that's the very issue when it comes, for example, to the climate emergency situation we are living. All these issues that relate to our survival on Earth and the climate emergence, as we know of as today, has to do precisely with thinking about plants not as resources that we need to use for our own sake. So insofar as we keep thinking of plants as resources, we haven't managed to get away from this Ptolemaic way of thinking that we are at the center of the universe. We are still thinking of plants as objects. A resource is an object, something that I can exploit. So the exploitation of resources. Even when we think in a very good-hearted way about, okay, you know, they provide us with oxygen, we need them, we need to care for the forests, everything, we are still thinking of it as a resource for us.
Yeah.
We need to forget about ourselves. So this is, again, something I discuss in the book, because I think unless we truly make the effort to think of plants as subjects and not as objects, so as agents and not as resources, we won't escape this, or we won't hit the solution to the problem, because we will still be into these dynamics of thinking of our Earth, the planet Earth we need to save for us.
Right.
No, we should think of plants in themselves, for themselves, regardless of the fact that we need their oxygen.
Yeah.
So that's another way to put it.
Very elegant. Very elegant. Paco, when's the new book scheduled to come out?
Actually, it's coming out. I said hopefully, but yeah, it should be coming out December, I guess. December.
Okay.
End of the year. Just coming out with Norton in the US, and with Little Brown in the UK.
Okay.
So then I don't know about translations, but anything, I mean, the original in English, it will be coming out with Norton in the US. And
what's the title? The title going to be?
It's called Planta Sapiens.
Say that again?
Planta Sapiens.
Okay.
Oh, Sapiens or Sapiens, how you pronounce it?
Planta
like
Sapiens,
Homo sapiens.
okay. Got it.
So like Homo sapiens,
sure,
like
sure.
Planta Sapiens.
Very cool.
Yeah. So Planta Sapiens, I mean, to me, really, that's the key. That's really the key to forget about ourselves if we really want to save ourselves paradoxically. However paradoxical that sounds.
Fascinating, really fascinating stuff. Paco, I want to, thank you for taking the time to talk to us all about all these issues. It really gives, like I like to do, really a lot to think about, and new ways, as you were saying, to jettison old ways of thinking and sort of a standardized model, and looking at some of these alternatives. I love the principle of sort of this unnerving of intelligence, as we talked about offline, and really wishing you the best with this, the lab, the book. For everybody that's going to be watching on the YouTube channel or listening on the podcast, you've been listening to Dr. Paco Calvo, Laboratory Director at the Minimum Intelligence Laboratory, Universidad de Murcia in Spain, really working at the fascinating intersection of physics, biology, cognition, focusing on plant neurobiology, ecological physiology, and body cognitive sciences. Really cutting edge stuff. And I just once again, Paco, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to do this. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And as we say, thank you for helping to make tomorrow a better place for all of us via this work and via this knowledge that you're putting out there. It's been really a great time.
Well, thank you. It was great talking to you. Really, thank you.